With Module 24, we're getting the rework to the Temple of the Spider. Not just graphically, as you can see here, they sure did some good work there, the artists, but mainly mechanically in the boss fights. With the first boss having unique mechanics with barrels, choking gas, phasing, and ultimately having a lot of abilities inspired from the rogue. And the second boss being more like a drow with demonic spells, and you'll take a lot of damage and have certain phases where you gotta kill a bunch of demons. And not much has changed with the final boss. Now, all of these enemies have something in common, at least in terms of their race, which would lead us to believe that gaining extra damage against Drow should help within this dungeon. And very nicely, within the new campaign, again with Module 24, which is yet to be released, North Dark Reaches, we will be able to purchase within the store, the consumable section, overloads versus Drow. Now the question is, do they actually work? So in this video, we're going to go through my testing of them and compare how good they are versus, let's say, Rage of Flames for a DPS. Now, I haven't tested do the wards work, but in all likelihood, if the Slayers work, then so will the wards. And ultimately, the wards aren't such a big deal, as you're going to want to be able to complete the dungeon with tanking and survivability without needing to rely on a ward. Now, even those of you not interested in running the dungeon whatsoever, especially the master version, can still make quite a decent amount of profit or gains from these overloads. And the big reason is, when you go to your campaign, North Dark Reaches, and check out the store consumable section, you can buy these overloads. And you can check in your inventory that these overloads are not bound at all. You'll be able to go to your auction house and you'll be able to actually sell these things for Astral Diamonds. So that will definitely be something newer players can look forward to, just to help master running content players, because most of them, like myself, are just not bothered enough to go and farm them. I already struggled with doing that with the overloads for against dragons for Tiamat. So just something not to miss out on, that you are aware of that then, that those are unbound and you'll be able to spend your currency to buy those and sell them. But let's see if they're actually going to be worth buying or even selling. Let's jump into my testing. Now, I haven't tested do the wards work, but in all likelihood, if the Slayers work, then so will the wards. And ultimately, the wards aren't such a big deal, as you're going to want to be able to complete the dungeon with tanking and survivability without needing to rely on a ward. Generally, people just want to min-max their damage, whether that's just to get through it quicker or to compete against their allies, and so that's what we're going to mainly focus on. Do these Drow Slayer overloads actually work? Unfortunately, when you go and purchase them, as you can see from the store, brand new, they're only going to last you 1 hour. Yikes. Yeah, well, you might want to use them not for the entirety of the dungeon, as spiders aren't considered drow and a lot of the ads are spiders, so a Rage of Flames might help a bit better there. Now, these new overloads to Drow Slayers are very similar to what we've seen with the Dragon Slayers, and I haven't been able to actually properly test Dragon Slayer overloads, and even that, the other types of enemy bonus overloads, as they don't show up on the combat tracker, so it's hard to actually judge exactly how much damage they're dealing. So we've got to go and test the Drow Slayer, see do we gain any effect in our fights. Well, we got down to business. We soloed the first part of the Temple of the Spider, got to the first boss, and we went to test our overloads. Here, we unequipped our armor or anything that's going to give us additional stats that will adjust our damage. And we were seeing the max hit of our Duelist Flurry was 8,419. We went to double check that as well, again, a few more times, just to make sure that was the damage we were dealing. And now we're expecting this overload to increase our damage by 10%. And unfortunately, going into this fight, we didn't seem to see any effect on the increase of our at will. As you can see, using the overload, we're still only seeing 8,419, which is exactly what we're seeing without the overload. But then I came to the realization that it was an additional hit, and that is probably exactly how the dragon overloads work versus dragons. They are an additional hit, and whilst you're in game and have your combat log open, you can see all these numbers here, and you will occasionally see like Dragon Slayer done X amount of damage, and you'll be able to see the same with the Drow Slayer. And then with a parser, with the advanced combat tracker, we can exactly see how much damage it is dealing against our target. Now, whether that is 10% or not, we shall see. So I then done a full run of Master of Temple of the Spider with this overload slotted. Wow, what a mess. And we wanted to determine exactly how much damage it was outputting and whether it is worth it or not, especially comparing against, again, the Rage of Flames you would get, let's say, from the Hell Pit event right now, using those challenge tokens, and you'll be able to get them from the new lockboxes as well, and they're probably pretty cheap at this point. But the DPS ones, including the Devil's Precision, are usually a lot more expensive, and straight up, you would think 5% is worse than a 10%. Just basic math, right? However, keep in mind the Drow Slayer is only going to affect at-wills encounters and daily powers. That is very important. As we have a look at our parse here from our fight, this is the first boss. You can see that here with the details, our DPS 366, and we're fighting the Halbrine Darkstalker, which is the first boss. And you can see that same parse here of our damage, 366 encounter DPS, and the Drow Slayer was dealing nearly 12,000 in counter DPS, and you compare that with our overall DPS, and that is the equivalent of 3.24%. So straight off the bat, you would consider that 3.24% is going to be worse than 5%. Wrong. And the reason is because this 5% adds to other damage buffs before multiplying by your damage. And when you do that, you'll end up reducing the amount that you would actually gain by the amount you already have. It becomes proportional like that, so as you don't end up with insane stacking damage values. It's what Mod 16 made a big change to the game. And ultimately, when we compare the two, Rage of Flames with a 5% additional damage buff and the Drow Slayer with an additional damage source, which was a 3.24%. So simply we're adding this to our overall damage, and then you can see that ever so slightly is the Drow Slayer overload better. Now, the reason the Drow Slayer overload is not dealing a full 10% of our overall damage, as again you see in this parse, it should be 10%. But again, as you can see, it's only going to be affecting your at-wills encounters and dailies. And when you actually look at a parse of somebody's character, you can see, for example, Bigby's Crushing Hand and Oppressive Darkness and Bleed. All of those aren't considered at-wills encounters or dailies. In some instances, Bleed is, but in others it's not. It's a bit wacky there. And those are our top 3 damage sources already not being affected by the overload, whereas a Rage of Flames actually would affect it. And so you can see for the first boss, it's ever so slightly better than a Rage of Flames, and personally for more burst damage, Rage of Flames would be better to make that mainly mount power hit even bigger during that artifact call. We got like a 5 million hit, and that's not the entirety of the magnitude that it can do. It's really good. Trust me, Bigby's Hand on a rogue compared to just tunnel vision, you're going to see an increase for sure. I do, at least. Now, another very important factor with regards to this first boss is you have a lot of adds that you have to kill, and not all of them are considered Drow, so that Drow overload won't necessarily affect it. You have barrels to kill that are exploding. They are really important. You have max damage against them. And then you also have spiders. Those aren't considered Drow, and I'm not 100% sure if her clones are actually considered Drow. But let's move on to the second boss. Is it going to be worth it in that fight? Well, this boss is a little bit more single target orientated, as you mainly just have the boss with not really any adds while you fight her. However, you do have a part where you phase, the boss becomes untargetable, and then you have to kill these demon things, so your Drow Slayer is not going to help you there. And again, looking at the data, you can see the Drow Slayer was about 9,000 DPS, which again, comparing to my overall damage of 287,000 DPS, that's 3.24%. Exactly the same as we were seeing on the first boss. So this comparison still stands of the Drow Slayer only being ever so slightly better. Again, that second boss is a pretty rough boss to beat, but in my opinion, it's actually the easiest boss. You aren't as much time pressured. You do sure have the demons to kill, but if you have enough damage and you do kill them, you have all the time in the world really to get through this boss. There's not much pressure with regards to ads gonna be killing you all the time. There isn't the orangey of that. There's just the mechanic of whether you get one shot or not, depending on how many stacks you have. Just play the mechanics right and you can take your time on this boss. And so we move to the final boss of the dungeon, Thidrith herself, and she's most definitely a Drow. And we can confirm that again with our data, we were indeed getting the Drow Slayer to proc with 371,000 encounter DPS, with this being the fight just here. You can compare again that is indeed the damage we're getting with the final boss. And you can see again the Drow Slayer was 16,498 of our DPS, which means the total percentage in comparison to our DPS was actually 4.44%. So this time it's even better to run the Drow Slayer, and the big reason is because you're just fighting this boss. You don't have any ads to deal with. You don't have anything else to fight other than the boss and occasionally a cocoon which you have to burn down. Unlike the other bosses where a lot of the damage becomes the focus of either killing demons, killing spiders, barrels, and you get the point. So if anything, I would take the Drow Slayer for the final boss of the dungeon, and that's about it. Again, there's not much point going all out competitive in damage in the standard version of the dungeon, as that's just standard and it should be relatively easy unless you're really trying to try hard against your teammates and top those leaderboards. But in the master version, you cannot go wrong with trying to min-max everything you possibly can to make sure you have every single advantage possible to get through this dungeon, as it's designed to be pretty challenging, and especially from the beginning you're going to have mechanics which will kill you, so you may as well go in with as much damage as possible. And these overloads are going to be relatively easy to obtain. I will go over an overview video again and explain how you exactly obtain these, but you will just be doing heroic encounters and some repeatable quests, and you'll easily get these coins that you need to buy these. So ultimately, yes, very nicely the overloads do work. However, they don't work as well as you'd expect of increasing all your damage by 10%. And just on a note of that, they do indeed deal 10% of your damage. You shall see as an example hit. We check the base damage because that's unmodified before any debuffs or resistance of the enemy. You can see 2.8 million base damage just there. This is my shocking execution. And when we look at the exact timestamp 185042 and check with our Drow Slayer overload, and we get that exact timestamp 185042, we can see it's a Drow Slayer hit, and the base damage was 280,000, which is exactly 10% of what we're seeing with our daily power. So it is indeed exactly 10%. The unfortunate thing is it's not benefiting from combat advantage, and I'm not sure if it actually crits. But you can see it is modified by debuffs. You can see this is during an artifact call. That's how we got that high base damage. However, my daily power was a dodge, whereas the Drow Slayer wasn't. And you can see then its damage went up to like 333,000. So overall, it seems to work exactly as intended, and that's very good to see. Not really worth it for the first and second boss, but for the final boss, I think if you want to get that edge in DPS, it's definitely worth it there. Now, if you really want me to double check on the wards, you can just let me know and I'll do my best. It might take me a while though before I find time to do that, but for now we can probably assume they work if the Slayer ones do. But it's never good to assume anything in this game without some further testing, as yeah, things can be very unexpected. With that said, I'd like to give a special thank you to all of these channel members for helping me keep my channel going. And if I presented this well, consider leaving a video a like. And if you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.